How's it going, guys? Z Butler TCG here. We're gonna do a different video today. This is gonna be a little bit longer. It's gonna be on contemporary card rules. So this is something that fellow TCG player writer Johnny Lee has talked about in great detail, and I just wanted to bring a more maybe easily approachable platform to explain it to people who don't feel like reading the entire article and reading Road to the King and stuff like that. So first and foremost, why do we use contemporary card rules instead of just monsters, spells, and traps? The reason for this is pretty simple. If you just say monster, spells, traps, that doesn't really encompass the full scope of what cards in the modern age of Yu-Gi-Oh! Do. For example, Lady Debug is a monster card, so is Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. But they serve very different roles. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, is used to destroy cards and be a defensive card, and Lady Debug is used to search out other cards and do things like that. So just saying monster cards isn't very good at explaining things. Or like Sign Up Mining searches cards, and Mystical Space Typhoon destroys cards, and they're both technically spells, but that doesn't really encompass what they're for. So we use contemporary card rules. I'm going to go over all of the major ones with a quick little explanation of each. I'm going to use mostly Salamangreat cards to explain this, and I'll use a couple of generic examples. If this is a series that people are pretty interested in, more like core theory, things like that, I can go into more detail on each of the card rules. I can make a video on each, and then different aspects of the game as well. So we're just going to jump right in. The first rule is your starter cards, and they are, simply put, cards that get your engine started. So good examples of starter cards are Lady Debug, Sign Up Mining, these are a little bit more fluid, and Soul Eating Oviraptor. So these would be some pretty generic examples of starter cards. These also qualify as starter cards. There's an interesting thing to note here, though, that not all starter cards are equal. A good example is Lady Debug is just strictly better than Flame Buffalo because Flame Buffalo requires you to have the extender in hand with it, whereas Lady Debug does not. So that's an interesting thing to note too. You would prefer to have more precision starters like Lady Debug, Sign Up Mining, Soul Eating Oviraptor for a generic example, as opposed to, say, Flame Buffalo, which requires you to draw cards or anything like that. You generally want to have 12 to 14 starter cards. This gives you an 80-ish% chance to open up with one in your opening hand if you're going first and you're playing 40 cards. This is primarily good because you get to play the majority of your games. You'll notice in my videos I tend to sort out my deck profiles by their card rules, and starter cards are always first. They are the most important part of your deck because they are what allows you to play. So one common thing that I see newer players struggle with is they'll think that, well, if they just play nothing with starter cards, their deck is so consistent that they can't lose. And while your deck is consistent, the issue with that is that it's consistently mediocre. And that brings us to our next part, actually, because you can have the most consistent deck in the room with all the starter cards in the world, but if it doesn't do anything, then you're just going to have a consistently terrible deck, which is why you then have, after your starter cards, you have extenders, such as Salamangreat Foxy, Salamangreat Gazelle, Jackalope, Pot of Desires, Jack Jaguars, Spinny, and Falco. So here's a wide variety of extenders. We're going to put these two together here. So interestingly, in some of my deck profiles, you'll notice that I have used Gazelle and Foxy as starter cards. I've called them soft starters, and that's because they can fulfill the role of a starter or an extender depending on the circumstances. Pot of Desires actually also falls into this category as well, but this will get its own discussion in a moment. So we'll actually put these off to the side. So we'll just use these as the examples. So Gazelle is obviously a superior extender, and there's multiple types of extenders. The two that are generally discussed the most are superior and additional extenders. An example of a superior extender would be one of these three down here, and an additional extender would be Falco, and potentially even Spinny. The reason why this is is superior extenders tend to require less setup. Tcgplayer kind of falls in the middle, but it can be an extender on its own as well as a starter, so it leans a little bit more towards superior extender. They require less setup for the same amount of output generally, whereas a card like Falco requires you to have a Salamangreat on the field to then bounce to hand and have the Falco in graveyard to be able to do that. It just requires a lot more setup. You generally want to have, again, 12 to 14 extenders, and you would prefer to have superior extenders whenever possible over additional extenders. So another generic examples of extenders are Danger Jackalope and Pot of Desires. Pot of Desires falls into this category purely because it just you almost never want to see Pot of Desires as your first card when you play anything. That would just make no sense because you're running a risk of not being able to do anything then. Another good example of superior extenders would be Doki Doki in the Rock deck. This is because these all give you the ability to just push forward more, and they all make your deck more consistent. And when you think of the most powerful plays your deck can make, cards like this are generally responsible for you being able to get to those plays. So Doki Doki gets you to all your tuners. Danger Jackalope and the dangers in general make your deck more consistent, as well as being bodies on the field, and Pot of Desires lets you see more cards in your deck, which is why it's an extender. From there, you've got your removal cards. This is just an example of in-engine removal. You've got Salamangreat Rage, Salamangreat Roar. Let me grab off camera here really quickly, and Twin Twisters, for example. So we prefer in-engine removal whenever possible, which is why these are better than this in the example of the Salamangreat deck. However, not all engines are able to have in-engine removal, which is why cards like Twin Twisters, Cosmic Cyclone, and Lightning Storm see so much play. Removal, whenever it's either in the engine via a searchable engine card like this, like Rage, being able to be searched via Gazelle, and then by proxy, all the other cards that search Gazelle. Whenever it's an in-engine removal card like this, you want to minimize it so you don't have to draw it, which is why you'll usually see more copies of a card like Twin Twisters as opposed to Rage in a deck. If you see someone playing removal, you'll see like 3 Lightning Storms versus like 3 Rage. Even though Rage is an in-engine card, by having it be in-engine, you have so many more effective copies when you want it that you don't need to maximize on it. Another interesting thing you can do, though, is use your extra deck to facilitate the role of removal in certain scenarios. So you could have cards like Nightmare Cerberus and Nightmare Phoenix facilitate that role as well. This is preferable to having main deck removal outside of extenuating circumstances such as the format requiring it, which is why you'll see certain decks have to play Cosmic Cyclone, but most of the time you'll see like cards like Nightmare Unicorn, Nightmare Cerberus, Nightmare Phoenix, etc., played. That's because they are essentially searchable as long as you're able to play. Any 2 monsters can then become Nightmare Cerberus, any 2 monsters can become Nightmare Phoenix, as opposed to having to hard draw your removal cards. That's very preferable. You want to minimize the number of removal cards, especially if you can play engine removal, because it's easier to access, and then you don't have as many awkward draws where you're not really able to extend your game state any further. From removal, we go to defense, and defense is a little interesting. So there's multiple types of defensive cards. So you've got, and I want to preface this by saying Hand Trap is, I would argue, actually not necessarily the best way to put certain forms of defensive cards. For example, these are both hand traps, but they serve very different roles. So you've got removal defense in the form of Gamma in a hand trap, but you've also got a reactive extender such as Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. These facilitate very different roles. Gamma is obviously just used to get rid of the problem card, and it's very powerful, which is great. And then you've got cards like Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, which you want to use to get to your more powerful defensive cards and to make your deck more consistent. This allows you to reactively raise your ceiling by seeing more cards in your deck, which makes your deck more consistent, which is why cards like Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, Maxi, and cards like that have historically been so powerful. Gamma is a purely defensive card, though you could argue it's actually a reactive or defensive extender if, you know, you activate it on your turn and things go pretty great. Doesn't generally happen, but in some scenarios it does facilitate that role. Another type of defensive card, though, is Dynamiscus. This can facilitate both of these roles, actually, because it primarily is a defensive card, but it can also be a reactive extender in the sense that if a trap card activates, you get to get a free card back. This is why cards like Dynamiscus have seen so much popularity over the course of their lifespan in the game, because they have multitudes of effects, which is great. An example of another card that has a multitude of uses would be Farfa, Malebranche of the Burning Abyss. It is a defensive card because of its primary effect, but it is also an extender and even a starter in the deck as well. And it's also even removal, and that's what we're looking for when you're looking for cards to play in your deck, is you want to have the ones that facilitate the most roles the most efficiently, because that means you can minimize the numbers needed to play and you can make your deck more consistent by having more redundancy. So that's your defensive cards. Those are some prime examples. Other examples would be cards such as Nibiru, and cards like even Red Reboot, though I would argue this is more of a bomb. And then the final type of defensive card in that actually is a Floodgate, which would be Imperial Order in this example. Floodgates are the ultimate form of defensive cards because they just don't allow your opponent to play at all, and they're generally pretty powerful, which is why Red Reboot can also fall into that category. From there, you've got the card category of bombs, which in the Salamangreat deck could be Will of the Salamangreat. In the Rock deck, for example, a more popular example would be Block Dragon. In the let's see what other decks are there right now. There's Eldritch, Rock deck. In the Dino deck, that could be something like Double Evolution Pill. Bombs are your most powerful cards in your deck. They generally require a lot of setup to really be useful, which is why you don't typically see a large quantity of them played. You want to play a pretty minimal number of them, usually like 1 to 3, 1 to 4. Certain bombs like Block Dragon also can be just extenders on their own too. Same with Will of Salamangreat, which is why they can actually be played a little bit more. Historically, some bombs that people might recognize are Soul Charge and Blackluster Soldier, Envoy at the beginning. They require a lot of setup, but once they're used, they can just end games by resolving, and that's what these sorts of cards can do. Bombs are your most powerful card, and you usually want to use these last whenever possible. From bombs, you've got engine requirements. I'm going to show 3 different kinds here. So you've got the what we colloquially call a Garnet in Dark Magician for the Red Eyes package. Salamangreat Sanctuary also can fall into that a little bit more, but then there's the third kind of engine requirement, which is a card like Spellbook of Knowledge, which can go from a engine requirement because you only want to play 1 because it just makes your more powerful cards more useful, but it can go from being a pretty horrible draw to being a Pot of Greed. So it can go from literally being a Garnet to a Pot of Greed, one of the best spell cards ever printed in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's an incredible amount of flexibility for a Garnet to have. You generally only want to play 1 engine requirement. I've seen a lot of people play, multiples of their engine requirements. Historically, we call them Garnet because of Gemini Garnet, where they would play 2 Garnet for their 3 billion fusions, worried that if they drew their Garnet, their billion fusions would be dead. Statistically, it is correct to only play 1, and I can go over that in a future video as well. And then the final card rule in main decks would be the deck filler requirement. That doesn't really have a name. Upstart Goblin is the only card that currently falls into this category. Into the Void can also arguably be in this role as well. These are just there to make your deck more consistent. Cards like Upstart Goblin, Into the Void, Chicken Game, things like that don't do anything other than reduce the card count in your deck. This is really good for your deck building because it means that you can increase your odds of seeing certain cards more often. And that is the most basic breakdown of the contemporary card rules that we use to this day. Originally pushed forward by Patrick Hoban's group, and then it's been refined, and some of it's been debunked a little bit by various players over time as well. But these are the most general ways to view contemporary card rules and why we use them. If you guys have any questions, let me know down below, and I would love to make more videos like this if that's something that interests everybody. Have a good day, though.